The Trees of Ancientia. The tree surgeon was close friends, a companion of the tree historian. The tree historian was a historian of trees, who told the stories from the perspective of trees. He did studies of ancient trees, as well as the modern ones too. Studies of the ancient pictures of the trees. It was those pictures that led him on to the tree quest, to try and discover if any extinct ancient tree seeds could still have been preserved, could be lying in dormant, in waiting to be discovered, especially those extinct ancient tree seeds that could be dropped into lower caverns way below the earth, that have never been extrapolated, nor had any archaeologists study or find them. There were many reasons to consider if it really was a journey worth going on. This journey of discovery in search of the ancient extinct tree seeds, the legends and myths of which there were many, of course, but no real hardcore actual evidence to prove beyond any doubt. There was no evidence to actually prove beyond all doubt that those extinct ancient seeds of those trees really existed at all. The seed pods could have been preserved and stored, perhaps in an amber capsule, there was some theory to that, or they could have actually been some remnants of them that had long ago fallen into a deeper underground cavern of some sort, one that had not been able to be visited, was ill frequented by people. Yes, there was some speculation about whether there could be, potentially, any extinct ancient seeds at all, from a whole variety of different plants, flowers, right up to trees of all different types. Who's to say that those vivid stories and pictures, or the folklore and mythology, those of the ancient trees, that had all manner of different kind of caricatures, giant trees, dwarf trees, wild trees, monstrous trees, even angelic trees, even animalistic trees, trees that would really bend the imagination, if those were really just vivid imaginations only, or perhaps if those were the attempts to actually portray a totally unimaginable past, an ancient world that was incredible, dreamlike, that was beyond our own acceptance, our own ability to accept, and the dreams perhaps of those that were returning, those that weren't just wishful thinking, but those that were returning to memory of an ancient tree. Perhaps those were just the children's attempts to draw the weird trees that they happened to see themselves. And maybe there were caricatures of that, but maybe they were caricatures or something that was factual, real. Who knew though? With those whole variety, so many different pictures that they were drawn, yes, different anatomical abilities that they had, and could indeed be cartoonish, yet many of those were quite obviously real animals that they were portraying sometimes. So might not also some of those giant plants and giant trees and strange trees of all different sorts, might not some of those also, those exotic plants, might not some of those pictures also be real? The tree historian had speculated that for a long time, studying a great many of the different ancient strange tree pictures. Who would wish, though, for giant trees of that sort? I mean, who would exaggerate that much? For what reason? Unless it was perhaps just having fun. Or maybe they just did it as an experiment. Or maybe it was just an imaginative thing and they just did it as a challenge. Maybe there were other reasons, because we didn't know why the ancient people drew the things. Nevertheless, they were juxtaposed against other things that did seem like they could be well realistic. So who could be really sure? What if those ancient extinct plants really did exist, the ones from the pictures, and they weren't just vivid imaginations for whatever reason drawn? It was all this wild speculation and unknowing, therefore, that made the purpose to go on the journey itself unknowing and hard to discern. Yes, it probably was all just a potential wild goose chase for nothing, and there was no real race, of course, for the ancient extinct possible plants. No, even some of the wild speculative trees, there was no race at all for the ancient extinct trees. None at all. Because no one really credibly, seriously believed any such things existed. or if there might be such things, whether it was worth justifying the expense of a huge journey and all the risks that that would involve, without really knowing. Even if a few seeds of some kind had somehow survived and were preserved from so many thousands of millenniums of years ago, however long ago, it could be far back into the deep reaches of ancient history, however far back, if somehow some had preserved so long, then still, how would one ever know where to search for such things? If there could be only a small fragment, a small remnant, however few, it would be impossible to find or know where they were, unless one knew a way to search for them. Those seeds, the remnant that could be hidden under the jungles, the deserts, the forests, the mountains, under oceans even too. Those that could take many lifetimes to explore. You couldn't dig up a whole forest, nor search under the mountains easily. Large groups of explorers could spend lifetimes, could risk lives and limbs just for trees that may be hypothetical, risking life for a tree or the idea of them that never existed. Never mind if there could be giant trees or trees that produced any number of unknowing fruits, or any number of exotic unknown fruits that could be. Yes, and there could be yielding, nourishing trees as well. Yes, there could be reasons if one was sure. What if there was a reason for all those trees for becoming extinct anyway? Would bringing back mysterious plants also be a great risk to a world so far separated? Or would curiosity and desire to know be enough, and those fears of the unknown plants, the mysterious ones, be conquered? No one was really that frightened, of course, about the return of extinct mysterious trees, of unknowing trees, however grand their pictures might appear. Whatever they grew as, even if they grew exponentially and were tall and giant, or exceptionally wide in some way, or grew exceptionally fast, and grew at an alarming rate, however it was, in whatever they were exceptional at, in consuming, in producing, in their rate of growth, in any number of things. No one was really concerned that much about that. Because who could be? Who could fear something that was grounded, rooted in, trapped in just one place and time, that would always only ever be there, that you could just easily run away from? And a tree wasn't really threatening in any way, not according to the modern idea, our modern knowledge of trees, of course. It could be harmful to eat the wrong parts of a tree, to swallow the wrong berries or leaves or bark, to do any number of wrong things. But a tree itself could never chase after you or hurt you. No, there didn't seem any risk. There didn't seem anything to fear for most people. Who really could fear something that was trapped and grounded in only one place? Yes, of course, there was nothing really to be fearful of. And yet, what if the ancient trees, those extinct ones, what if they did actually speed super fast, like Japanese knotweed, spread incredibly fast, and that its roots could easily get under and into and around firmer things, and to actually penetrate through firmer objects? What if they were not only fast growers, growing fast over things and around things? What if they could suffocate walls, crumble walls apart through their thick, swelling ivy? Like ivy, but something even worse. What if it was an invasive, revived ancient plant that could strangle buildings, turn them into dust, crumble them down to nothingness? If something like that was introduced, even with caution, then of course the world would be in a shop of horrors. And an island that it was introduced to, if it was a remote place, of course it could be studied there and it would be different. Yes, there were reasons to be fearful of such trees. That could be invasive and dangerous, not just to buildings that they could strangulate, that they could crumble, unsettle the foundations of, and even that they could grow inside and crumble inside the walls of. Of course, young revived saplings would be monitored closely in the greenhouse laboratories under a variety of light and soil conditions, growing together in their plant nurseries. But we won't necessarily know what kind of mysterious fruits that they could produce until much older, when the plant's much more mature. It would be impossible to really recreate the ecological biodiversity and the wider ecological conditions that those potential revived seeds would have originally experienced and grown up in, and even perhaps wilted in the ancient ancestral world. in their great parental habitat that is now, of course, so much transformed by the millenniums. Many of those insects, animals, fungi, and bacteria, and many other plants, of course, would have changed and evolved, adapted greatly. Many of those that had existed then would have also become extinct too. Other familiar species of plant and animals that may have existed then in their day may long ago gone away. Yet even they may have genetically altered the ones that remained and have adapted and mutated much into different strains and different species over the years. The dormant seeds, once reawakened, will need to be monitored and observed, especially during its early transformative years, the earlier phases. If only for a limited number of seeds, even if a limited number are found, then each of those much more carefully must then be observed and then cared for accordingly. If lots of seeds are then preserved, there are then lots of tests more that could be done to determine the correct conditions that would need to be arranged for them to be trialled out in growing in larger numbers. Perhaps if the trial numbers are too low, then genetic cloning or somehow gene transfer could be looked into potentially, just as a possibility. While the tree historian knew little about that and the modern sciences, though he would look into that if it came something to be urgent later. Since he only really studied the history and mythologies too of trees, so that he had really invited a tree surgeon just over as a friend to consult him and discuss some of the areas that he knew little about, and also if he could refer him on to others that might do. The tree historian had a reasonable knowledge of the current plant biologies, of many of them, and access to plant biological databases too, as much as anyone could as well. Yes, and he could also talk to biologists too, to learn about their great diversity. Yet he was also studying primarily the stories, the pictures of older trees and plants, and potential plants. Many of the more recent stories seem verifiable. Yet the older ones, much more older, of course, the ancient ones, would be much more speculative. And there, of course, were less credible evidence there then, only just theories, really, that abounded. So many of them. For the many ancient tree stories, there were stories and pictures, of course, many of them, but compared to the modern ones, there was really a poverty of evidence. In that way, many of the plant matters would have long ago decomposed anyway, so that there really wouldn't be too much physical material to study anyway. And then all the disputed evidence, the claims of the various things that remain of the extinct trees, those could be disputed too. Those perhaps had also decomposed themselves. The amount of stories themselves, the literature and the pictures, those would have decomposed. Only a limited number of those ancient pictures of the ancient trees would exist anyway. So we don't really know what the ecological conditions would have been back then. Yes, some rocks and stories and various artifacts and things were retrieved and were studied to some extent. Yet they were argued to be petrified remains also of ancient extinct plants. Yet it seemed impossible to really prove that those were the petrified remains of actual real plant life and not other kinds of objects and other materials as well. Given that no one absolutely knew what the ecological conditions were all the way back then in the ancient world, no one is there to record exact factual evidence as a historical record. So there was no way to know exactly how they had lived and died, how they'd grown and fallen and withered. Could they have decomposed in a very different way? Could they have grown under very different ecological conditions? Because the Earth's atmosphere was so different, of course, many, many thousands and thousands of years ago from an ancient world. The ecological conditions could have changed so differently, so much over such a long time. If they had grown so differently in the past, grown at different rates, grown in different ways, then also could they also have decomposed at different rates, decomposed in different ways too, potentially. The tree historian had kept an open mind to it, being rather agnostic, equally wary of rejecting or accepting many of what were really speculative theories of the ancient extinct trees, of the ancient extinct tree remains also. He was really open-minded about all those things, agnostic, and didn't know what to think of it, was sometimes swayed a little more this way or that way, but often sat on the fence, and had a lot of strong belief to think and suspect some of those remnants could have been parts of trees, but wasn't sure what kind of things, if they were even that. A people person for many years, he got wary of only studying human history, of course, instead of other things like animistry, a history of animals from an animal perspective, or tree history from a tree's perspective, as he was currently more submerged within. Man at middle aged had striven to refocus him on his history classes, onto the less anthropomorphic planetary history that he'd evolved into gradually. For a few years he'd moved on to that. He learned, of course, then later about the animistries too, learning from biologists, also learning from farmers too, from animal husbandry, people that have cared and looked after many animals, breeders, also ecologists as well as learning from a great many veterinarians and those that were part of the animal husbandry, and even gamekeepers too, who taught him much as well about the current situations of a great many of the animals, and those that also befriended animals and had pets that he spoke to often also. Then there were the environmentalist groups also, that gave many animal talks and different lectures, and different lecture rooms that he'd visit. So he wasn't just reliant on his own observations of a limited number of animals in his limited environment that he chanced to meet, just the brief glimpse of the animals that he would see nest building or in the midst of it, or stalking a prey or out gathering food. No, that was no substitute for the actual wider animal life story, his own limited subjective experiences with only a few animals in only a few places. He studied animism, or animology as it was also called, in a much wider perspective. Animals from different areas and different lands, studying many different people's accounts of different animals. Those who worked with animals, those who cared with animals, and those who lived with the animals too, to get a much more well rounded, accurate account and story of the animals. It was the animistry studies that had later led him on to further studies, to want to further studies other histories, the histories of the trees, of the plant kingdoms themselves, plants, trees, bushes, flowers, and more green foliage beside, where he spent years shifting through pictures and stories of alleged ancient trees and bushes and plants. The tree surgeon was an older man. He was part retired from it all now, though. He didn't go out and then call on often others to help him doing gardening or doing vegetable explorations. No, not that often anymore. Didn't do that sort of thing. Arthritis didn't allow him to climb the trees that high anymore. Not so easily as he used to. Or to visit the remote hilly landscapes, certainly not the wilder lands, harder to get to now in his older age. He did visit a number of orchards still, sometimes, as a tree surgeon occasionally, and he would still visit sometimes to a few local orchards of those, where he did perform the tree surgeries, minor operations often. Usually he just gave some advice on some treatment if the tree was infected, or if it was just talking about the pruning sometimes as well. And that was precisely just what the tree historian had called him for, really, to discuss more of that. Because they had met and chatted sometimes in the past, seen each other occasionally, as one does as an acquaintance, at various allotments, eco-villages, and at various tree and plant festivals that they'd gone to, seen each other occasionally over the years, where they'd become a little more friendly, after some of the seminars, when they'd been seated close to each other, had talked a little during the breaks, getting to know about each other's overlapping professions, and they'd been having longer discussions about arboretums, which they'd gotten on to talking about, forestry museums, tree museums, as he liked to call them, the tree surgeon did. Both local and ones afar, they talked about very distant arboretums they're thinking of going to, and local ones that they'd both visited and studied, discussing the challenges of adapting the habitat to the changing environmental factors, like the different weather, the conditions of the people, and the animal visitors also, and what they all brought with them. Then the plant doctor, the tree surgeon, as he was called, He said that he was concerned about all the different people, the increase in the amount of visitors, both the animal people and also the people visiting as well, and the animals also, saying that the sheer amount of them, all the litter that it would drop, different vandalism, churning up the lawns, taking different plants, cuttings with them without any permission sometimes, and moving things around the place, even uprooting smaller plants sometimes, the tree surgeon had said. All sorts of things, trashing, vandalising, spreading muck and ruin in different places. And that was with all the monitoring and the signage and all the warnings, and even with the groundskeepers too. Still, with larger amounts of visitors, there were always more risks in that sense. It could undermine the scientific nature of the work of preserving all of the many species in a protective laboratory condition, so that it was, while it was being nurtured, matured, and studied more, it was more protected. He was concerned that too many visitors were now being allowed, that it had become a popular tourist resort, and that people weren't paying attention to all the different regulations, weren't reading the signs, were trespassing onto different areas, and were even going to the lengths of vandalizing, climbing on trees that were really quite vulnerable. And he was concerned about the amount of that. Still, he saw the interest in the arboretums in any case. That it was evolving into some kind of tourist resort in some parts of it, for people to have fun and explore and to have nice romantic getaways and nice picnics together and just to have time with family. A nice, comforting place to walk around that was shaded and leafy and attractive. And in nice weather, it was lovely to go there, scuffling through the piles of leaf fall. People went there to play and have fun and study and chat with each other, to spare a nice off day. Yes, and some areas were good and adequate and okay for that. But some of the wilder areas that people had trespassed into, disturbing some of the natural habitat, brushing aside with leaves, ripping off branches, stomping and stumbling over things, climbing up branches, all sorts of unnecessary things that were increasingly going on, the tree surgeon had informed his friend, shaking his head in disbelief. That could have been nesting homes of smaller animals sometimes, and leaving behind litter, trampling over smaller plants underfoot without even noticing them there. And even people were careful sometimes, often were, to leave it as they found it, not dig up small rare plants, take them home, or trample over areas without looking what they were doing, climbing over things without knowing what it was, and to take all their litter home in the boot with them, or deposit it in nearby bins that were gradually being extended out everywhere, and not to take any of the flowers, however much they adored or loved the smell of them, or thought they would be wonderful, attractive things to allure their visitors at the house again. No, just to be passive wanderers and look around and study the miniature Eden with awe and wonder, but not to take anything from it. No, because they could be unwittingly contaminating the miniature Eden that was growing, with new and rare species being introduced together in ways that had never done before. That was experimental and early in its years, and still, therefore, fragile in its way, with all the different strange bacteria as well. Whatever they were carrying, the people and the animals, they could be bringing all that bacteria into the woodland itself and harming the poor trees and the plants, especially the rarer species, where there were so many few numbers of them anyway. And of course, those that were already struggling anyway with their own problems, those that were not potentially rare, but just that their strain could be rare. And so they could be struggling in terms of their lower numbers. There have been many plants and animals found at some of the arboretums, the local ones, that couldn't possibly have got there on their own, though. Exotic varieties, far and away species. Who knew where they came from and what effects those were having on what was potentially a fragile ecosystem? During the many discussions about this over the years, about the arboretums, the plant historian had often argued that maybe the trees did need some human and animal contact sometimes, though, and maybe that was an important part of the relationship. Perhaps it was just only a matter of contacting them and having encounters with them in the right way, and then making the instructions clear to visitors what those were, what kind of things it was okay to take, from what area was it all right to take leaves or cuttings, and from what areas was it not to? What areas of the lawn was it all right to trample over, and where was it not all right to do that? So maybe just having some more greater flexibility and encouragement about people climbing trees, telling them there were areas that they could climb and those that they could not, and making sure that they were able to access areas to be more experimental and to be more physical and adaptive in engaging closely with the trees themselves, allow the animals and people to get up close and explore some of the trees, the ones that they're able to, and give them good signage to avoid the ones that they shouldn't. They shouldn't climb the ones that could harm them or the trees themselves. The historian's reasoning was that the man of history was long entwined with the tree's history, and that it was really clear that it was a mutually beneficial relationship. With so many trees that somehow became too wild when they weren't being harvested and pruned and cared for by other people. So many times there were when things had worked out well in the past, when trees were providing all the leaves and the fruits and often their wood, all the off cuttings and dead wood, and they were providing resting homes to smaller animals also. And that if they were pruned and cared for, then it was a mutually beneficial relationship. If the other animals and the people cared for them enough, then the trees could actually provide for the animals and people in a sustainable fashion. So it could develop, and in many times in the past, there have been close, mutually beneficial living relationships as well as working relationships. But not living so closely to the earth, and with a great many different kinds of trees, different kinds of bushes and plants, then maybe people were too distant from those to know what the different regulations were anymore. Many people gathered in woodlands sometimes. People had lived and died in them in the past, worked in them often through their lives. In the better part of history, for much of it, most people had worked in planting fields and agriculture, planting fields of crops and harvesting them too. They grew out of the forests anyway. Why had some trees been growing separate from humans for so long, grown too wild, whilst others were being nurtured and cared for and pruned regularly? People didn't even visit some woodlands that had just grown so remotely wild, excessively wild. Some never saw a tree, or a grove of them even. Never mind visiting a woodland. Why not allow people and encourage them more to arboretums and other areas, so long as they're following good regulations from those familiar with their eco-structure in preserving the most fragile parts of it, but also encouraging any good productive relationships with animals and people too, encouraged on the tree story. And it could also inspire many other visitors as well, give them the chance to go on, explore other habitats themselves, and know what the rules were in their explorations. But finally, after they'd discussed the Arboretum and the different regulations of them, as they did often, and they continued their earlier discussions, finally the tree historian had wanted to ask his friend, or the tree surgeon, all about this potential hypothetical journey that had been proposed to him. That he thought was a wild goose chase, but still, a little part of him thought there could be something in it. Of course, the main reason why he thought there was no race to the extinct ancient potential trees at all, none at all. Perhaps long ago it had aroused much interest and excitement then. But then, when nothing had been found for an age, for a long time, for many generations and centuries, then of course it seemed like there was nothing to find. An absence of evidence seemed to prove an evidence of absence. But of course, no one could search truly under every mountain, under every forest, or under every tree. So really, of course, whatever had been searched, and there had been many epic searches and journeys in the past, nothing substantial as yet had been found, or had been reported to be found in any case, or been proven to be. But it didn't mean that there weren't any. Still, there was only a little part of him that thought there could be something into it. He'd explained that to his friend, the tree surgeon, telling him his reasons for just considering it. Maybe it was just a fantasy and something that he hoped to find. Who didn't want to find something fantastic? I don't think these sound or look anything like trees, really, said the tree doctor, looking over the strange pictures that he'd been given to look at. What was really just a sample of some of these stranger ancient tree pictures. No, well, perhaps they're not. They're not modern trees. Not anything you think of as a tree, no. Not as we'd understand them. Could they not be some distantly removed ancestor, though? Perhaps very distant. Not of any tree you know? Inquired the tree historian, now looking over at the table to the tree doctor, who then nodded and said he didn't know of any such living tree that looked anything like this picture. Too strange to be any connection to a tree, really, advised the actual tree surgeon, telling the historian to go and talk to a biologist who would know much more about it than he would anyway. He was only familiar, had only really operated on a limited number of trees, really. He could do a fuller search with biologists, really. But he appreciated seeing him and found the pictures interesting, looking through a whole catalogue of different ones, with little scrawled in notes beside them, and circles sometimes in different places. Well, who will be joining them on this journey then? Finally, the doctor had asked. And then the historian had said he didn't really know. And he didn't know whether he would go on it himself or not, really. Still, it was worth asking. He wanted to find out more about it, to see what other people thought, if others thought it really was also a wild goose chase, or if there could be anything in it. Perhaps it was a chance worth making. It's just difficult to know. It's such a small chance you'd find anything. Oh, but then in the past when they did the searches, maybe often they didn't know what they were looking for or when, or they didn't have the right equipment always to do it back then, the earlier searches. It's hard to know, really, rambled on the historian. Since he was seeing him away, often, he didn't really get the chance to see and talk to him that much. He went on to discuss the various equipment that would then be needed for any potential journey if they went on one, and then if anything was actually found, to set up a potential tree nursery, all the equipment and the cost that would be needed for that as well. And then he discussed how the potential ancient seeds would need to be stored and then driven in transit in and out of potential nurseries also, until finally they'd have to be introduced into one of the smaller arboretums, one of them that was deemed fit for its conditions. Have its own arboretum, who knows, with a handful of the ancient extinct seeds that could be found together. Imagine if they were all found together, a handful of them. It would be better to grow them all up together as well, in an ancient kind of extinct seed project, where they'd all just grow up in one small plant nursery or something. Well, that was the kind of initial plan anyway, that had been drawn up by those that had proposed to do the journey. That's what the tree historian had said. They would all grow up in their own little grove of trees, perhaps, if they were ancient extinct tree seeds that they found together. Then perhaps they would all also preserve their symbiotic relationship if they had that together also. And he speculated that potential seed searchers would have to work hard to do all that, though. They were sat there at the cafe, over their drinks, discussing the hypothetical journey, imagining it all to themselves. The doctor felt it was like looking for a leaf in a jungle, though. Impossible. That may or may not even exist. A fool's errand. No, he said, not worth even doing. As he'd summarised after thinking it over, after their chat about it at least, and the tree historian had said he wouldn't perhaps only go as far as 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 well, he said perhaps he wouldn't go that far with it anyway. It was just something he'd look into a little, really, as it would just be an opportunity, really, to learn much more about a local environment he was exploring anyway, if he was going there anyway. He could also be studying the local plants and animal, even the local people and their language and their custom and their food too. If he found a credible location, if there was also some plausible evidence that could justify him going all the way out there anyway, then he could go on an adventurous travel holiday, an active holiday anyway, that was adventurous. And who knew, if there was enough evidence that was credible to say that there could be something out there, then that could be enough for him. It would be like a study holiday, as well as an active holiday too, depending on the type of location, if it was possible to do that. Perhaps even a work holiday. Unless it was at the mountains, of course, and he was having to go through there, he'd not be able to do all his work there so easily, though. Then, of course, the doctor, having listened to this, having been a little interested in the collections of the pictures that he'd been studying through with his eyes, and listened to some of the earlier stories too about this, he then said, although, really, there was no actual evidence at all, because those pictures he was showing from those areas, They could have just been the imaginations of ancient people, even if, yes, they obviously were ancient people that had drawn them. But they could have been their imaginations of various exotic plants, rather than actual, factual recordings themselves. So that was nothing to justify a risky experimental trip of any sort, really. Although, as the historian had pointed out, the absence of evidence itself doesn't always give the evidence for an absence, really, leaving him with fantastic speculations, or wild imaginations, whatever. The Dr. Fenn then had left him with well wishes, and with the tea leaves at the bottom of the cup that he stayed looking into, staring down at the fragmented, broken parts, as if they somehow could hold the answer to the mystery that had fixated him and the other proposed journeyers as well. Why had they all been so consumed in thinking about it for so long? After many of the strange exotic pictures had emerged that all seemed to have some clear resemblance to something nearby them in the picture, juxtaposed to something that did seem real. Still, it could have just been something bizarre and imaginary, but within a real setting. Yes, perhaps it was just imaginative thinking within a factual context. Many of those strange exotic pictures of the ancient trees, so similar from very different cultures, though, from so many different parts of the world as well. That was the other thing that made you think they weren't all having the same wild imaginations, but all in different parts of the world. He'd asked this to the doctor before he'd left. He'd also said, as many others had, though, the same answer, that people had been travelling and migrating for millenniums anyway, so perhaps they'd all just borrowed the same pictures and the same ideas, taking it from one place to another and moving it to multiple places, changing it each time like Chinese whispers, so that it gradually adapted and changed into other things. But they were always culturally borrowing from each other, travellers thousands of years ago. But this was not an entirely acceptable, satisfactory answer, not for the tree historian himself. Since before the history of the boats, from an earlier age, before the history of great travel, before the history of the wheel even, as well as boats, many people found it hard to travel that far, had to walk great distances back then. Many places were actually inhospitable or very distant and remote, hard to get to, took very long time to ever reach. People were often insulated in. Very rare did anyone actually get there in ancient times. Travellers could be rare and remote, in certain inhospitable regions at least. So in those regions, perhaps cultural exchange couldn't happen to that degree anyway, for so many pictures to have been borrowed and swapped, if they'd been insulated so much of the time for so long, in more of the remoter, distant, inhospitable lands. That made more sense. For so many of the cultures that had been so cut off by the climatic conditions for so long, to have had so many similar pictures of things that never existed, so fantastic, that seemed itself quite unusual and spectacular. But perhaps the few travellers that had managed to get through, however rare, perhaps they had brought large collections of different pictures. Perhaps. Perhaps people were travelling more than historians could really know about and prove. Perhaps more than they were aware of. That they were much more able to travel through inhospitable conditions somehow, despite having a lack of technology or abilities to travel. Yet still, even if they hadn't left behind many traces of the routes, maybe they had gone on them. Who knew? Just because they didn't have any roads back then, or any way of driving in any way. They didn't have any tracks even to get through much of the wilder forest and mountain and desert and even the flooded swampish areas as well. Much of that inhospitable terrain, of course. It was much harder to get over and to get round or through, where you could have to walk, ramble, climb, or swim. There was no driving through it at all. There was facing the elements and going through them. And it was quite remote and rare. And there wasn't much cultural exchange of many other types of artifacts at all. So why only in that area? Too many unknown questions, though. Yes, many did have a good reason to have gotten through there and were able to get through later on, when the roads had opened up and there were more tracks and there were less obstacles themselves. But that was a long, long time later, surely. But did enough tribes really travel such vast distances in the earlier time? There probably wasn't even enough evidence to really absolutely know either way, speculated the tree historian, now feeling that he was at a loss. There was no real way of absolutely knowing if such exotic ancient tree seeds could even exist. Never mind whether they would be searching for, if they did. The alternative theory, of course, to the fantastic pictures was that actually it was that they were inherited from a much earlier world, perhaps when continents were much more connected or something, from a time when there wasn't so many separations, when people were much more connected in some Pangea or time before a great flood, if there have ever had been, or some other great cataclysmic event that could have separated humanity out into different inhospitable, remote, different locations. That perhaps those different pictures were from a much earlier age, when travel had been much more widespread, or when people weren't separated by great expanses of ocean, of seas, of deserts, of mountains, when those things weren't always necessarily there, before those had emerged, through earthquakes or through floods. Perhaps they were remnant that had survived from an earlier age. Another theory that the tree historian had also to consider, weighing up a whole variety then of different alternative theories, and not knowing the past, his species' past. I found that strange. He didn't even know the history of his own planet, never mind other planets or other species. Still, what it was, he didn't know. There were a great many different speculative theories that he was agnostic about, considering all different theories. If that theory was true, of a cataclysmic event, that somehow only a small fragment of art remained that had some consistency about it, then perhaps it was a different thing altogether. If that was true, then it was allowing the possibility that those images and stories of the more ancient unknown, strange trees and other animals, even spectacular trees, they weren't necessarily all invented, but rather inherited from an earlier, more stranger, ancienter world, or mutations of an earlier image or story that had been told. No, that still didn't answer all of the actual questions that he had about it all, though. No, it didn't prove whether they were inherited stories, or invented ones, or later adapted, made up ones at all. Why was he so obsessed with finding or knowing about this mysterious mythical Eden, or these mythical giant trees and ancient extinct plants that there might or might not be? Whatever it was, why was he and all the others wanting to go on the journey so obsessed with it either? Why were they? Why were they all? Why was everyone? But why weren't other people? Was also the question he asked sometimes too. Wasn't it natural sometimes to think about the missing chapters, the earliest chapters? Didn't it seem strange? None of us knew the earliest chapters of our life, of the ancient world. We didn't know what these ancient trees, ancient humans, and ancient animals were. We didn't know what the ancient climatic conditions were. That we all had these missing chapters in our early life as humans, as a species. That humanity should be tolerating and okay that we didn't know our own history, not fully. Or did it not matter that much, the fact that it was so long ago, that we'd all adapted, evolved, and moved on so long ago, over such a vast amount of time? Does an individual really need to know the first few years of his life? The fact he's got no memory of it? Can you just abandon your childhood memories, as if it's not that important for an older person, or an elderly person especially? Can you just live without it being known, have it as a mystery, and it's not a big issue? Or is there something about it that makes you want to know what happened in the past? What was the mysterious past? What were the trees that grew in the mysterious past? What were the animals and people? What were the places of this mysterious past? Wasn't it natural to be curious about all those things, about all of our own earlier missing chapters? Or perhaps it was just trying to speculate too much on an ancient past world, to not live in the current future one, or the present one itself. To have your own origins only as theories and hypotheticals, though, and never as factual and never as known, and to always have a mystical past and always be trapped as a species, never knowing their own past, always a mystical species and never a known one to ourselves. It seemed unsettling to think it would always remain a mystery forevermore, and at some point, someone, somewhere, we might not all discover it. Hopefully, maybe there wasn't enough desire for us all to, or maybe there was just too much fear of it, or not enough fear of what that might mean, or not enough desire either. Who knows, thought the tree storeroom. He really wasn't sure. Perhaps other people privately were also really interested in the ancient plants as well. Not necessarily in the possibility of reviving them at some point, but in what they could have been like and how they could have lived together with them. Living on the earth seemed more important than the history of the earth. Living was always more important than history. But of course, what was the point in living if you didn't ultimately know the reasons for life? And didn't reasons begin at the beginning? If you didn't know something at the beginning, then and the purposes created at the beginning, then you wouldn't have known where it's grown to. Or did the purpose emerge gradually over time, later somehow? Was it important to know the full history of humanity and the trees that it might live with, or didn't it matter that much? How strange it was, though, to be a people that were mysterious to ourselves, really, and each other also, to live in a world of mysteries, not just with mysterious people, mysterious animals, but mysteries of trees and the mysteries of histories.